All right, Vice Chair, we are ready to begin when you are.
All right, very well. Thank you, Brandon. If you don't mind, Brandon, if you'd start off by reading the guidelines for our modified meetings procedure due to the COVID-19, I would appreciate that.
Yes, I'd be happy to. Thank you. So just like we begin every meeting, I'll be reading some guidelines for our modified meeting procedures. And these provisions are made to ensure that we comply with the Kansas Open Meetings Act through the COVID-19 pandemic. Board members and other meeting participants must state their names and titles each time they speak. Various members of city staff are present via Zoom and in person in attendance, and we must also state our names and titles each time we speak. All motions of the board need to be stated very clearly. After a motion is made and seconded, the chair or vice chair, in tonight's case, will call on board members individually to provide their vote. The chair will then announce whether or not the motion carried, as well as a count of the vote. The agenda for the meeting provided instructions for how to submit public comment and how it would be handled during the meeting. Written public comment was supposed to have been received by the posted deadline, and we did receive a few written correspondence, and we also received one request for in-person public comment via Zoom. The chair will call for in-person public comment for those without access to technology options, and anybody who wishes to provide that would have been here in the audience this evening, but we do not have anybody with us present in the commission's chambers this evening. And finally, I want to remind everyone to please mute themselves when they are not speaking. And again, that reminder to state your name before you speak each time you speak. Thank you.
Very well. Brandon, just for clarification, is Mr. Watts on for public comment tonight? Did not catch it.
Mr. Watts did request to provide public comment on the general public comment portion of the agenda, as well as in response to one of our agenda items, agenda item number 3. He is not logged into the meeting yet. He has been provided with the link, and if he does join us, then I'll let him in from the waiting room.
Okay, very well, thank you. So our agenda is going to begin tonight with public comment. I'm just going to go ahead and read the statement for this. And the public is allowed to speak at public comment after first being recognized by the chair or the vice chair, except that any complaints or comments regarding individually identifiable officers are not allowed. Rather, any such comments or complaints may be provided to the board in writing, and the board will forward such comment or complaint to the appropriate person within the Lawrence Police Department. The board may establish reasonable limitations on the allowable length of public comment. As a general practice, the board will not discuss or debate these items, nor will it make decisions on items presented during this time. Additional couple of points I'd like to make. The public is allowed to speak to any items or issues except those scheduled for discussion on the agenda. Individuals wishing to provide live public comment must register as outlined at the top of the agenda, and the public comment is limited to 3 minutes. So since we do not have Mr. Watts current with us at the moment, I would like to speak and acknowledge, if I may, to a few communications that were submitted and attached to the agenda, and appreciate the folks that took the time to submit these. First one, the subject is a citizen's perspective on campaign 0. So hopefully folks, you guys have had a chance to read that. The second is from Mr. Watts. It's called the editorial, Keep Pushing for More Information About the Lawrence Police Department. And I believe there's an additional one from Mr. Watts regarding eliminating police officer fatigue. Control how many hours police work. So that is all I see that is attached. Brandon, would there be anything additional?
This is Brandon McGuire, Assistant City Manager. No, I believe you have referenced all of it. And I just checked through my email to make sure that Mr. Watts was not having trouble logging on. And he actually, as a courtesy, sent me an email just a little bit ago advising that he may not be able to log on after all. Or he may not be available after all.
Okay.
I believe we can move on at this point.
All right, thank you very much. So we're going to move on to the first agenda item in the training on bias-based policing, and don't want to hold up this person's time since we're so very fortunate to have her with us tonight. So I'd like to introduce Deputy Attorney General Kate Carter, and she will go through some training with us on bias-based policing.
Thank you very much. I am very happy to be here. Lawrence is my home, so I have an interest. In addition, I don't do these trainings anymore, but it is one of the things that I enjoyed the most in the time that I've worked with the Attorney General's office. Back in 2011, a new set of statutes became effective for the state of Kansas relating to racial profiling, which from that point on was referred in the statute as racial or other bias-based policing. And it changed several things. It changed how people can file complaints about racial or other bias-based policing. It changed how those are reviewed, and put in place some policies and requirements for departments. And as part of that change, I was hired by the Attorney General's office to help implement those. And we established a racial or other bias-based policing unit within the Attorney General's office. Now, that was funded with a grant. The legislature did not fund that. And eventually the grant ran out. And since that time, some things have changed. There's no longer a full-blown unit, and we don't do the training that we used to do. At the time, though, the training that we did an awful lot of law enforcement training. I worked with the Kansas Law Enforcement Training Center and departments across the state in training law enforcement officers in a curriculum that the state really bought into, so to speak, called Fair and Impartial Policing. And it was a specific curriculum, and officers from all over the state were trained so that they could go back to their departments and train law enforcement. The Kansas Law Enforcement Training Center in Hutchinson, several people there were trained, and the other academies that are around the state as well. And I also, as part of that, trained community advisory boards. And I trained a couple of different ways. One, I brought the curriculum that we used for law enforcement officers and narrowed it down to a couple hours training for the community advisory boards to be able to see what are law enforcement officers being trained in. What is this new curriculum? How does this work? What are the considerations? And the other training is the comprehensive plan training. And I have done these trainings in Lawrence over the years. As I said, it is one of the things I enjoyed the most in that position. And I have to say, I enjoyed teaching it in Lawrence probably more than any other city. What was supposed to be a 2-hour training would become a 3.5-hour training because Lawrence people are so involved and interested and well-informed. And if they don't know, they're going to ask, you know, what about this? What about that? So I have been looking forward to this evening, and I am very grateful to be here. I do have a slideshow, and I apologize that that was not provided ahead of time. The turnaround time on this ended up being very short because of just some logistics in my own office at our end. So I will tell me to slow down if I'm going too fast. Tell me to back up if you have questions about a prior slide. But this training is, I'll go ahead and pull it up. About comprehensive plans to achieve the fair and impartial policing. I mentioned that this is a curriculum. There we go. And the primary source for this material was curriculum that was prepared by a company called Fair and Impartial Policing, and Professor Lori Friedel, who put together this team. It started in the Department of Justice under a grant and then moved to an independent operation. And so the training that this follows, what I discussed before, is the Fair and Impartial Policing training. That training covered implicit bias. Bias that is unconscious and may not be consistent with your own explicit attitudes and values. And it affects your perceptions and your decision-making, and all humans are subject to biases, implicit biases, and conscious biases. And that includes me, you, and law enforcement officers. And at the end of that training, we get to this point and talk about in what ways in a department might bias manifest. And this was the visual of that question, the answer to that question. But you can see it's broken apart because, again, in that training, and I'm sorry to refer to it so much, but we talk about well-meaning officers, officers who believe they are not biased, but have unconscious biases. And we also talked about ill-intentioned officers, racist officers that are explicitly biased. And again, this is across the board. In that training, I talked about studies where doctors treated people of color differently with the same symptoms as a white patient. These are people that mean well. They took the jobs that they took, including law enforcement officers, to help people. But because of family values, social media, everything that you've taken into this point has created implicit biases. So recruitment and hiring can be impacted both by well-meaning officers and departments with people that have implicit biases, and it can be influenced by racist officers. Policy can be impacted by well-meaning officers. That's a little bit more difficult for a racist officer to implement their racism into policy. And that's true for training too. But well-intentioned officers and departments can manifest bias in training and in policy creation. And that's true for supervision and accountability, assessing the policies and practices, and how you measure the objectives of the department. So that's kind of our starting point, and it gives us specific targets to talk about what should be in a comprehensive plan. What should our goals center around? And it's a tool that we can use to achieve fair and impartial policing. And change efforts are achieved by a comprehensive plan. And in Kansas, under the statute, a comprehensive plan that's related to racial and other bias-based policing is optional. It is not required of any department. But if a department does adopt one, and it would then be presented to the city council to adopt formally, then the law requires that it include policies prohibiting racial or other bias-based policing to guide well-meaning officers and address racist officers. It must include policies to promote the recruitment and hiring of a diverse workforce, to ensure the workforce is comprised of people who can police in a race-neutral and non-biased fashion. It must include training to promote employees' controlled responses to override racial and other biases. It must provide ongoing training of supervisors to enable them to detect and respond effectively to biased behavior. And it must implement a style of policing that promotes positive interactions between police officers and all communities. These that are listed on your slide are not exactly as I read them, because we are branching a little bit broader than the specifics of the statute. So what I read you were the specifics of the statute. Now, a governing body, whether or not they have a comprehensive plan, also could have data collection as a policy for their department. And that can be a part of the comprehensive plan also. And it should be considered by any department that is considering a comprehensive plan. So let's start with policy prohibiting racial or other bias-based policing. And under the statute, the purpose of this is to guide well-meaning officers and address racist officers. Kansas law requires every department to have such a policy, whether they have a comprehensive plan or not. A policy is required. This is the Attorney General's office policy. Members of this agency are prohibited from engaging in racial or other bias-based policing as provided in this policy or prohibited by law. It appears pretty straightforward, but there is room for discretion there, depending on how we define things. Starting with racial or other bias. What classes do we want to protect? And I might open that up for suggestions. What areas might we think we would want in our comprehensive plan to protect? Besides race, we specifically address race. Are there other areas that others think of?
At our last meeting, Jenny Robinson, board member, at our last meeting, we discussed the addition of adding the housing status and socioeconomic status, so individuals cannot be discriminated or experience bias-based policing based on those.
I also think of the federal ones, age and disability. Those are some that show up in federal law. Are there others that people think of? I'll go on to, these are the different classes that the statute in Kansas view as areas that we want to be careful, guard against, bias against. And just these: race, ethnicity, national origin, gender, and religion. Departments may choose, just as the areas that you discussed, may choose to have other classes, if I can use that term, that they want to ensure are protected under their policy. But these are required under the state of Kansas. And you see the words up there, unreasonable use of. Racial or other bias-based policing is defined as the unreasonable use of race, ethnicity, national origin, gender, or religion in police activities or law enforcement actions. So just these 5 areas: not age, not disability, not socioeconomic. So fairly narrow and specific, but again, not limiting departments. The other part of the policy is not to engage in the bias in policing. And so how is policing defined? It can be defined in some ways as the decision points where a law enforcement officer must make decisions. Who, what, when, where, how. Who am I going to surveil? Who am I going to arrest? What activities are going to trigger my surveilling or arresting? At what point will I take action? Does the time of day impact my decisions? Does where I am enforcing or patrolling impact it? And how do I respond? Do I respond with an arrest? Do I respond with an inquiry? These are all decision points where bias can be triggered. Under the statute, however, it is limited to 3 decision points. Those are making a probable cause determination to arrest somebody. So referring to our policy, it is prohibited to engage in racial or other bias-based policing. It is prohibited to engage in racial or other based bias when making a probable cause determination to arrest somebody. So that means without a warrant. This is when an officer observes something, typically a felony, and make a decision to arrest. Or formulating a reasonable suspicion that a crime has been or is being committed and the officer is going to detain somebody or stop a vehicle. So observing someone with a cracked taillight. It's prohibited to engage in the bias at that point, or making a probable cause determination to search an individual or a vehicle. So this is also part of our office policy. And this is the model policy that we have provided to departments for them to draw from when drafting their own policies. And you can see that this is broader than the 3 decision points we just walked through. First, it starts with the same 5: race, ethnicity, national origin, gender, or religion. But then it broadens to discretionary law enforcement. That's a much broader term than policing or law enforcement activities. And we go on in our model policy to list who they will cite, arrest, warn, search, release, or which persons to treat with respect and dignity. So this is probably in your policy, Lawrence PD, and it is very broad. So you should be aware of that. Yeah.
This is Sanjay Mishra, board member. So if we go back to the last slide, if we said this is in the policy that our local police is guided by, they should have data to do this.
Could you repeat your question, please?
Should they have data to report out on these factors?
I can't speak to that, how that is tracked, what the enforcement level is on that, how it's reported. I can't.
Go ahead. Sorry.
I think it's a legitimate question that you may want to discuss with your department, but I can't answer it for your local board, for your local department.
Again, Sanjay Mishra, board member, I asked the question because your last point was measurement.
Yes.
If you don't do all these things, then you are not basically completely following the directives or not doing Rob BP. If I start using that now. So if measurement is not there, how do you know they're doing this?
Well, that's
a question for LPD. Thank you.
Yes. Yes. And I mentioned data collection that refers to requiring officers to collect more data on a traffic ticket, such as race, how long was the stop, was there a search, was the search voluntary, if it was not voluntary, what was the basis, those kinds of things, more data. And I'll tell you that has come up pretty consistently every year in the legislature. Advocates who think that it's important that we should be gathering that data, and advocates thinking that that's problematic, and we'll actually talk a little bit more about that. But that is a question that does arise continually as we look at these things. Can we measure? How do we measure? And would we be measuring what we think that we're measuring? Because the measurement tool is subject to a lot of debate as well. Thank you for your question. So Kansas law requires that policies,
Kate, sorry, this is Brandon McGuire, Assistant City Manager. I see Vice Chair Littleton has her hand up as well. And I might just take this moment to ask, is it okay if the board members just jump in with questions as you go along?
it is, and I would welcome them because
Okay.
I'm not going to necessarily see your hand. So yes, thank you for asking that. Please do.
Yes, and I might also just advise the board members that Kate is likely looking at a very small version of you because she's looking at the PowerPoint. And I know on my computer, the gallery view really gets minimized when I'm sharing a screen. So I would just encourage, if you do have a question, just speak up.
Okay, this is board member Stephen. I'm speaking up. I was speaking and I was on mute, Kate, so I apologize. My quick question, I'm just curious. You said this statute came into effect in 2011, I think.
Yes.
So with the model, with the 5 and the definition, have those always been just the 5, or have any new been added, or is there any discussion to add any additional?
Those have been in place since 2011. It was not as broad as that before 2011. And I am not, I do not know what the discussion has been. When I was in that position, I don't think there was much discussion about expanding that. And that may be because local departments can expand it. But I'm not aware of any debate to expand that to other areas.
Okay, well, thank you. Yeah, ours is pretty comprehensive for the city and the police department. All right, thank you.
Sure. So Kansas law requires that the policies clearly define acts of racial or other bias-based policing. These are acts that violate. So using one of those classes as a predictor of criminal activity, any use of any of those classes, any use at all, unless the officer is seeking the person who has been identified or described by that class. So male, female, by race. So that's the only use. And any use of any of those classes as a motivating factor or basis for enforcement. So the objective is to clarify that it is reasonable to use those classes if it provides evidence, if it is legally relevant. The witness observed a white male. The witness observed whatever one of those classes is. That is legally relevant then when we are looking for our suspect. But if its use is based on stereotypes or biases, then it is not reasonable. So if we focus on the class as evidentiary, if it's of evidentiary value, then this is a suspect-specific policy. It's called a suspect-specific policy. And a hypothetical that we have used is this. A number of middle school students have reported that Latino men are selling guns to students in the area immediately surrounding the school. And so this gets reported to police. And what are the law enforcement officers going to do with that? Well, hopefully get more information, because the most difficult thing about this is it is so broadly based. Just broad Latino men. We need descriptions of specific suspects. A man who was old with gray hair, long hair, who, more specific descriptions are what law enforcement officers need to pursue this. And that is what they obtain by investigating, rather than not acting on something as vague as this. However, there are different views among personnel within the same agency regarding whether and how class is used to make decisions. And ambiguity and vagueness can create the risk of bias-based policing activities. A more specific policy would be something along the lines of officers shall not consider or otherwise be influenced by specific class in carrying out law enforcement activities, except when credible, locally relevant information links a person or people of a specific class to an unlawful incident, unlawful incidents, or criminal patterns. So that hypothetical that I gave would not be sufficient. We would then have the next step of getting more details, as I mentioned, specific to specific suspects, time of day, what activities were actually witnessed, what vehicles were being used. So when you get such a specific and broad prohibition here that the officer cannot consider the race, the gender, except when credible, locally relevant information, specific information is provided. And such a specific policy would disallow race being used as a general indicator or predictor for criminal behavior. It disallows the use of stereotypes. And it allows for the consideration of the class as one factor in making enforcement decisions. It relies on descriptions of actual suspects, not general predictions of who may be involved. And whatever the policy, the training provided on that policy will ultimately be the critical piece. Don't know if there are any questions. We're going to move to the next subject, but if we wanted to discuss policy anymore, please jump in. So state law also requires a comprehensive plan to have policies to promote the recruitment and hiring of a diverse workforce, to ensure the workforce is comprised of people who can police in a race-neutral and non-biased fashion. Although it's not specific in this statute, it is advisable to hire and promote recruits and officers who reflect the diversity of the community. It makes sense at an intuitive level, but there are reasons beyond that. It increases the probability that the agency will be able to understand the diverse perspectives of their community and to communicate in a more mutually beneficial way. It conveys the sense of fairness and equity. It enhances credibility, trust, and understanding. It also harnesses the power of contact, of the contact theory. Studies show that positive experiences between races reduces negative biases that each may hold against the other. And interaction at work is the optimal site for that, the contact theory. So good reasons based on science to have a diversified department that reflects your community. But recruiting a diverse workforce is not as easy as it may sound. You know, who is it we're seeking to recruit? Where do we find them? What do they have that others don't? And how will we know them when we find them? Are we recruiting in locations that have a diverse demographic? Are we advertising in publications or websites with diverse demographic draw? Are we using our minority department members to do recruiting, which would be a draw? So these are an appropriate subject for discussion when you are looking at your comprehensive plan. What are we doing now? Are we looking at the military? Do we recruit from the military? Do we go to religious communities, reach out to religious communities or specific cultural communities to recruit? Do we advertise in neighborhood or ethnic specific publications? Also looking at what happens once we've taken our actions, what the responses are. Looking at where do we lose people? Do we get people that answer our ads but then never follow up? Do they go through our application interview process and then drop out? Do we lose them at academy? Do we screen them out? These are things, areas that we need to look at to make sure there is not bias causing a filtering effect of our recruits and of those within the department for advanced. As I said, research shows that human beings have implicit biases, but implicit biases are weaker in people with explicit views of tolerance or appreciation towards other classes, and people who have had positive experiences with diverse classes. Are we addressing that in our hiring process? Are we screening to assess explicit bias? Are we screening for implicit bias? Are we trying to find those with positive attitudes? Are we looking at recruits, applicants that have a history of positive experiences with people of different races and nationalities? Do we ask about those attitudes? There is even, you may know, an implicit associations test, implicit bias test that's available online. And if you Google it, it's Harvard, an implicit bias test. You can take it, and it covers every bias that you can imagine. And I think biases that you can't. Are you biased against tall people? Are you biased against short people? Are you biased against bald people? It covers every bias that anyone could think of, I think. So we need to be aware of what is the background of our investigators, of our screeners, of our interviewers. Do they have implicit biases? And surely they do, but are they impacting how they are investigating, screening, and interviewing? Is the scrutiny more intense for some? How are statements interpreted? Or is there an objective standard? Identical behavior by Blacks can be interpreted as aggressive, while interpreted as playful when done by whites. That's based on research done by social scientists. Do we have policies in place that address those concerns? How actions and statements will be interpreted? Any questions about recruitment and hiring or comments? So Kansas law requires that the comprehensive plan provide for training to promote employees' controlled responses to override racial and other biases. Typically, law enforcement training includes cultural diversity training, training in Fourth Amendment, how to make professional traffic stops. All of those are necessary, but they are not sufficient to overcome unconscious biases. And there's research that shows that people tested for their unconscious biases, implicit biases before and after cultural diversity training. They learned things, They may have become more sensitive to some cultural issues, but it did not reduce their implicit biases. It did not impact that. So we need to address both issues. So the fair and impartial policing training is a science-based curriculum, and it does address the implicit associations. I'm going to recap just a little bit of that, and this is the training that I believe is included in your department's training. I have attended some of that myself, of law enforcement officers. So social psychologists point to the implicit system in our brain, and its whole purpose is to be reactive rather than reason. Its purpose is to make quick categorizations and generalizations. The fight or flight response is part of that. It's not based on a rational and conscious thought process. It's an immediate response to ambiguous issues that arise. And it produces mental shortcuts. And they can be valuable in many cases. They can be life-saving in many cases, and absolutely necessary. And it works below conscious awareness. Malcolm Gladwell wrote about it and called it the blink response. It's the mental shortcuts that include linking people on site to our bias, which is typically a stereotype. It results in quick generalizations, not subtle distinctions. And it results in automatic associations of people with unconscious concepts that you have of the group that they are in. Again, typically stereotypes. And those that can be commonly held in our culture. One common one is an association between African Americans and aggression, or African Americans and crime. And research bears that out. So how does the blink response or our implicit system manifest? When we lack information, our implicit system fills in with information from our unconscious. When we see a stranger, when we are in a new environment, when we're dealing with ambiguous situations, it pulls our implicit system into action, and automatic associations and biases are triggered. And as I said, the bias comes out of our social heritage, our own life experience, and our family systems, and all the media that you've been exposed to over time. Our blink response, our implicit system, relies on our stereotypes, our unconscious associations to fill in the blanks. So anytime that we face new, confusing, or ambiguous people, places, or situations, it is triggered. That training is integrated into fair and impartial policing curricula, and it's available at all levels and used at all levels. That training was developed with funding from the Department of Justice and Community-Oriented Policing System, and had a police development team which included law enforcement, academia, and social psychologists. The objective is to raise recruits' consciousness of that blink response, make them aware of the universality of implicit bias, provide guidance on overcoming it, avoid profiling by proxy, and it uses an array of teaching methods. So the goal is to understand that even good people have biases, that they impact what we perceive, and it can impact what we do. And policing based on those biases is unjust, unsafe, and ineffective. The goal is to give tools to the recruits, to officers, and up the level of command to recognize biased responses and to implement unbiased responses. They are given In the trainings, lots of role play and examples. One sample exercise is in a primarily white neighborhood. From a primarily white neighborhood, dispatch receives a phone call from a woman stating there's a suspicious black man sitting in his car on my street. And the question is, what happens next? And there is a full array of answers. One of the answers is you have your dispatch trained to ask more questions. What is this person doing? Are you in a gated community? Get more detail about why we should find this person suspicious, or help the person understand that it does not rise to the level of suspicion in terms of being investigated by law enforcement. I have heard some responses that if you are a sheriff, you're an elected official, and you respond to every call that comes in because that's your constituency. Recognizing that the man in the car is probably your constituency also, and so if you approach, or when you approach, address that situation. So these are explored in the course of the training in fair and impartial policing. Do you have any thoughts about that? Sure, yes.
Quick question. This is Sanjay Mishra, board member.
Yes, sir.
So you said good people have biases. And now I want to, based on your experience, how has this worked? How has the training worked? And how do you know that it is working?
Well, I can give you one simple measure, and then the caveat. As this was implemented across the state, the number of racial and other bias-based policing complaints against law enforcement officers decreased. So it would be very nice to say, we trained them and these are our results. However, of course, there are so many dynamics that go into that. Being discouraged about filing complaints. So how do you measure this? It's not measured statewide. It can be measured with the implicit bias test. And it has, in research, we have people take the implicit bias test and then go through some parts of this training or like training and take the test again, and you can measure the response bias is less. So there are ways of measuring it, but it's incumbent on those that are interested in measuring it to do so. As I said, they use all sorts of training methods. And it is not just race bias that is addressed. Here is a proposed stop protocol that might be used. Be courteous and professional, introduce yourself, state the reason for your stop, unless there will be times when this is not the process you can go through. But if it is an ordinary traffic stop or an ordinary walk and talk or knock and talk, these can be exercised to a greater degree. Keep delays to a minimum, make sure the citizen understands the purpose of the contact, answer their questions, provide your own information, preferably on a business card, and apologize or explain if you determine that this is not the person you were seeking or you have made a mistake. This can be a policy issue as well. Use of force training. This is not just marksmanship training. Use of force training, it is encouraged for departments to train frequently, use high quality training, use role playing, where the subject or the perpetrator demographics vary, gender, race, ethnicity, with random pairings with the threat or the weapon. So white woman with a weapon. Research shows that if you do that, the random pairing of different classes with the threat, say the gun, it forces the trainee to focus on cues other than demographics. And it can work to extinguish implicit bias against a class connected to a threat, that automatic association. I have seen the training that, unless it's changed, and it surely could have in Lawrence, where it's life-size video that's interactive with officers that are armed with, I suppose it's a laser gun. If they shoot it, it's a laser. And maybe Lieutenant Ernst or Trent could speak to that. And it is very lifelike. And it definitely can work on your biases. It does stimulate all those biases because things are coming at you in surprises. And how do you respond? So the more frequently that you can pair, make your victim what we typically think of in some of our automatic associations as the perpetrator, switch these things around, and it helps reduce our automatic associations and our implicit biases. When in the training that I did before, we looked at what was called a shooter study, where you have each person in the study has a computer screen, and popping up on the screen is a person and something in their hand. And the person that's part of the study has to decide, is it a threat? And they hit shoot, they hit the shoot button, or is it not a threat? And they hit the don't shoot or the no threat button. And in this study, they measured both errors and speed. And the highest error rates were associated with unarmed Black males. They were identified as posing a threat more often and mistakenly shot, the shoot button. And armed white males in error were perceived as no threat more often. Measuring speed, the armed Black males were perceived as a threat most quickly. Unarmed white males were perceived as no threat most quickly. In addition, Muslim males were perceived as threats more quickly, and females were identified as threats when they had a weapon more slowly than males. There was a write-up in Police Chief magazine, and the statement was, these study results show that participants were faster and more accurate when responding to targets that fit stereotypes. And that's what we work to overcome. So research indicates that positive study results were linked to frequent high-quality training received by officers. Again, this is referring to shooter studies that officers engaged in. And officers that had been through more frequent high-quality training did better on the shooter studies. They had no errors, as I recall. There was still difference in speed of response, but not the errors. The errors were not made. Any questions about training and education?
Kate, this is Board Member Stephanie Littleton. Is there any particulars as to how frequent that study, took into account?
How frequent the training was provided?
Yeah.
And I'm not aware of that feature. So I'm sorry that I don't know that variable.
That's okay. I was just.
We've been going about an hour. I don't know if you want to take a break or forge on.
Marie Taylor, board member, I have just one question on for this section. So if we're finding that these are the results of these kinds of study, what's the redress? What's the action to correct this beyond implicit bias testing when it doesn't seem to be making a change?
Well, I know, so these tests, part of the research took place on college campuses, which is very typical. And as I said, some took place with officers. The results of just taking that test repeatedly, not necessarily the same figures popping up, but random pairing of threat with demographics, repeatedly taking the test, improved performance on the test. So I think that speaks to it. You can measure to that extent that I am responding, as a test taker more appropriately because it's teaching me that my unconscious bias isn't effective in this test. It isn't effective in this response. And so that training that uses the same thing with, life-size video and an armed officer with a laser gun, that is going to improve their performance as they engage in that. So that's part of the frequency, but you can measure how much better you did on the test the next time. And it decreases your bias, so you're not responding based on your bias. You're just responding based solely on the threat you see before you and how you've been trained to respond. Does that respond to your question?
Marie Taylor, board member, it tells me that they get better at taking the test, but I'm wondering too if there's complementary studies that look at the actual data from incidents to link it up to whether those particular officers or those departments did how well they did on these kinds of tests. Because I mean that's the criticism of implicit bias testing generally, is that you can kind of game the test if you're thoughtful enough in how you take the test. So I'm just wondering, in which you may not know, but it just makes me wonder how much work has been done to kind of pair up the results of these kinds of tests with actual data on actual incidents.
A couple of thoughts I have in response. One, I have not kept up on the research, so I'm sure there's more recent research than I'm aware of. So I can't speak to that. I am aware of, I'm trying to remember, I think it was one of the shooter studies with the officers. Let me see if I have a note on that. I'm sorry, let me glance at this. They, in taking the test, I don't have notes on it, so I'm going to try and not misspeak. In test results, they could see that experienced officers did better than inexperienced officers. And I think that's part of the more you go through, the more you understand that demographics don't determine. So I don't think I can directly respond to your question as to what current research shows. But I do think that there are items that do show that experience and training do decrease the bias in actions. Thank you. Should we forge on or do, yes?
So this is Sanjay Mishra, board member. So one of the indicators for all this would be, since the 2011 statute and then the accompanying training and other things, that the race-based policing should have declined, right? Because people are taking tests and understanding and all that is happening. Is there evidence in the Kansas communities at least?
I don't know. Perhaps you could find out within your own department what's happening with complaints, that the nature of the complaints change. And I don't know as a state, the answer is I don't know. The next topic is leadership, supervision, and accountability. So we look to law enforcement not only as enforcers, but as peacekeepers, and even playing a role in prevention of crime and disturbances. And as we look to law enforcement, we naturally look to the leadership. So what is the message that comes from the head of the department, the message to the community, and the message to the agency? That and supervisors speak to the fact that organizational culture is the most critical factor influencing police behavior, and influencing the culture is the most effective means to deter bias. And what accountability tools are in place and how are they used? And just starting with leadership messages. As I said, it's not only the message that is out to the community, but the message that is passed within the agency itself. And leadership as well, to understand what the community hears and feels when they hear, "We will not tolerate biased policing." And community members need to know that frontline law enforcement is also hearing that. Beyond the chief or sheriff, we have supervisors that actually observe what is happening on the front line on a daily basis. And so policy can succeed or fail with that supervisor. Dealing with race issues in any supervisory position is fraught with difficulties, but even more so within a law enforcement agency. So in training supervisors, we have to talk about how does bias manifest, the science of bias. How do you identify officers who are manifesting bias? What do you do when you find them? How to talk about bias, and how might bias manifest in your own decisions. And the purpose is to guide supervisors in dealing with racist officers and well-intentioned officers. So how might bias manifest in a supervisor's own decision? There are different decision points. How much of a police presence are we going to assign? How do we get input from the community? How do we use that? What types of crimes do we enforce vigorously? What types of crimes do we ignore? In which areas do we use more aggressive tactics? And how much misconduct do we tolerate? every agency has accountability mechanisms to promote good policing. And those range from OSHA requirements, keeping everybody safe across the board, health and safety requirements. Those can also serve as accountability measures with some tweaking. And supervisors can use those to indicate initial concerns that they can pursue. And they can be used to pursue fair and impartial policing as well. Some data points might be simple observation of videos, reviewing random reports, reviewing random radio transmissions, and of course, a data point of citizen complaints. The complaint review process, these are other data points that can be used. Personnel evaluations, complaint review process, body cameras, other early warning systems or early intervention systems, and any data collection that is currently in place. The complaint review process is a critically important accountability mechanism, but it is important to know that it can't be the keystone to accountability or to the comprehensive plan. There are different ways of handling complaints. As you are well aware, Lawrence has been through some changes over the years. So there's internal affairs, simple agency review, there's civil review boards, and there can be a combination of the two. And there's a variety within our state. Some citizen review boards have authority to overturn department decisions, or at least the last time I was doing surveys, they did. So an example, an officer pulls over a car with 4 young Black men. Overtly, the stop is based on a broken tail light or maybe a cracked windshield. But is it a pretext stop? Does the officer see crime when he sees Black youth in the group together? It would be very difficult, if not impossible, to establish biased policing if a complaint were made about such a stop. It is very difficult in general to prove racially biased policing. At one point, the group that put this curriculum together reviewed complaint review processes and decisions nationwide, and they found at that time there were almost no sustained complaints. The norm is 0 sustained complaints. That can feel to a community like there is no accountability, and it can damage the community and the relationship. This is from a person involved in an agency review process. Profiling is intent-based. Without a confession, it's impossible to prove. It's very difficult to point to a specific piece of evidence. This from civilian board members, part of the complaint review process. It is subtle. It doesn't mean it's not there, but it's near impossible to determine when race is an inappropriate motivator. Maybe the officer's lying, maybe he's not, maybe the citizen is right, maybe she or he is not. For the citizen, it's often based on a feeling and maybe on past experiences. And in the complaint review process, talk about damage to the community, damage to the relationship with the community, damage to the citizen that feels harmed. On the other hand, the damage to a law enforcement officer's reputation, possibly to his or her career. It can also be life-altering. So great ramifications to the process. The process can be customized. Mediation can become part of the process. But some departments have felt that mediation re-victimizes the complainant. So that's something you need to really explore if you're considering it. There can be investigation protocols, ways to ensure quality interactions with complainants. The Los Angeles Police Department has a flow chart for those that are investigating complaints. There you have an objective list of things that need to be considered, evaluations to make. That promotes a comprehensive, consistent, effective review. And it can help disabuse an investigator from thinking, well, this person ran the stop sign or rolled through the stop sign, so they can't be a victim of racially biased policing. The fact that they rolled through the stop sign does not does not preclude the possibility that they were stopped because of their race, ethnicity, gender. And having an objective list can assist officers in leaving that notion behind. I could remember one of the very first interviews that I did in investigating a complaint when I interviewed the complainant. About a third of the way in, I realized that I was really cross-examining him and kind of had to take a step back and observe myself and what was I feeling and what was motivating this and what bias was that. So that's something. What kind of interaction do you have with the complainant? That's an element of the process that can be addressed by policies. Oh, there we are. Are officers investigating complaints conveying defensiveness? So there are ways to maximize the potential of the complaint review system, but again, it is not the cornerstone of fair and impartial policing efforts. With personnel evaluations, you get what you measure. What are you asking? How are you handling this? Is it a standard tool that is used with all personnel, or is it customized, or is it left up to each supervisor as they're evaluating personnel? Is it done on a regular basis? Most departments have some sort of an early warning system in place that just puts up a red flag that something doesn't quite fit, doesn't feel right. That same system can be used to identify racially biased policing. And personnel evaluations, there can be elements of your personnel evaluation tools that can assist in that. So elements to consider: communication skills, the ability to carry out duties absent bias, the ability to just demonstrate tolerance, and of course there are others. Data collection can be used as an early intervention system. It's important to compare similarly situated officers and identify outliers. So if you're using data collection on stops or excessive force complaints or complaints in general, be careful how you compare. That similar similarly situated officers are being compared? And are they serving similar demographics? So you could have a comparison like this showing that Officer D proportionally stops so many more members of minorities than Officer A, B, or C. But the other piece is what geographic area is being served, what shift is being served. There are more questions that need to be asked. The method can be used to identify officers, units, or beats that appear to intervene with minorities at higher rates than their matched counterparts. So similarly situated officers, units, or beats. So something like this, where you have shifts for our comparisons, gets you closer to a proportionally equivalent comparison to identify outliers. But this is not your conclusion. This is not what the department would want to use to take action. This is what the department wants to use to investigate more fully. It's part of the early warning system. So the identification can lead to further inquiry into circumstances and context to see if bias plays a role. You can compare that to other data points. Does that align with use of force complaints? Use searches for how many searches does this officer do in comparison to other similarly situated officers? Are they primarily consent searches? Are they productive? Research shows that African Americans consent to searches at a higher rate than white, say, this is in driving situations, than white drivers. However, searches of white drivers are more productive, produce evidence of crime at a greater rate than searches of African American vehicles.
Excuse me, may I ask a question?
Yes.
Marie Taylor, board member. For these early warning systems that you're identifying as best practices, is this something that the police department would do itself because it's more of a personnel investigation?
These would be tools available to the department. It can be provided for by the comprehensive plan. The comprehensive plan would say, these are the tools we want you to use, and these are the ways we want you to use them. So that way they become part of the comprehensive plan. But yes, it would be within the department, although any advisory committees or civilian boards could be pulled into that as well. The comprehensive plan could provide that quarterly reports are prepared for, your civilian board. So it's as narrow or broad as you make it, those that are working on the comprehensive plan.
Kate?
Yes.
This is Assistant City Manager Brandon McGuire. I might ask a follow-up question to that. Just out of curiosity.
Are you aware of some more innovative methods of monitoring the data, evaluating the data? Any models you might point to across the country? And I'm thinking, are there collaborative partnerships with maybe data scientists from a university, for example, that do this sort of analysis and provide insights?
I think that I could provide resources that would be able to link you to that. I can't off the top of my head. I do have some resources listed on one slide. that I can provide them.
So there are accountability mechanisms that are trust building, such as an independent complaint review board or a police commission or an advisory board. And assessments such as assisting in supervisor selection, training officer selection, and performance evaluations. Any questions about that section? We might be at a good stopping point, if that's agreeable, and we can pick up here when we come back together.
Sure, this is Board Member Stephanie Littleton. Kate, thank you so much. I think we have, what, another hour and a half to go?
Probably, yes.
Okay, so if everybody's good with it, yeah. This has been really, really good. We really appreciate it. Appreciate all your time.
Certainly. It is truly my pleasure. I am grateful to be here and look forward to our next meeting together.
Sure. Does anybody have any other questions for Kate? I wouldn't want Kate to have to stay on here all this whole time if you don't want to for the rest of the meeting.
If there aren't any questions, I probably will just go ahead and drop off. Thank you for your questions. I look forward to going through some more with you.
Thanks so much, Kate.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
All right, with that, next on the agenda, we're going to move on to receiving the Community Engagement Subcommittee meeting minutes from September 24th. I look forward to this. So
Is there someone from the committee that'd like to speak to these?
Board Member Marie Taylor. So we met, the subcommittee met, and I put together some minutes, but if the other two members of the committee would like to let me know if they accurately reflect the meeting, you should let me know. We haven't really discussed it.
Very accurate. Board Member Sanjay Mishra very accurately reflect. Thank you, Marie, for putting it together.
Bless you if you sneeze. I forget if you sneeze or not. Say bless you.
Okay. So should I run through that, or are there specific, what's most efficient?
Marie, maybe give us a high level and what you feel is most important through it. You know, we're good. However you'd like to do that. Okay.
So Board Member Marie Taylor. So we met on November 24th, and the agenda was pretty broad, was pretty open. It was more about information gathering to kind of figure out what resources are available, what other advisory boards typically do for community engagement. I think I think the sentiment was that all boards who are trying to have more engagement with the public are feeling at a disadvantage without being able to meet, because we're not able to meet in public, in a public gathering setting. So I think that a lot of it was just addressing what ways we could reach out, what tools were available for us to use from the city's resources. So that was, I think, the biggest takeaway is that there are some resources, but it's more driven by having a project that we're working on and trying to present. And so it seems to me that once we are ready to more actively engage and feel like we're ready to present, say in our instance, our big project is the ordinance rewrite, then that there would be a team of folks at the city who could assist us in developing the right kind of strategy for that project. So that, I think that's kind of the biggest takeaway. I did include some information though that just came up in the course of discussion that I thought other board members would be interested to know. And that was just to highlight that here is what activities the police department itself has been doing in terms of communication. And we discussed that Lawrence Police Department is working on a brochure that will be available that describes in detail the complaint process. And so I'm hopeful that it will be also available online, but then I've seen similar types of brochures at the public library for social services. So hopefully it will join those sorts of resources in those public settings and be readily available for distribution. We also talked just generally about yes.
Sorry, Marie, sorry to interrupt. This is Board Member Stephanie Littleton. Just a quick question on what you just mentioned about the LPD working on brochure. Was there any discussion, or is there a possibility for our board to have any collaboration on that brochure, or is that close to being finalized, or do we know?
Board Member Marie Taylor, I think it was Officer McKinley who was telling us that, so maybe he can fill us in on some of the details on that, and also to tell us a bit more about the plans to revamp the website for the department. So maybe if you wouldn't mind speaking more on those two projects that are going on with the department.
Actually, Lieutenant Dave Ernst can fill in on answer those. One with the brochure, there was a rough draft completed.
That has the skill set, not about content, but making a brochure look nice, et cetera, has been on some leave. And so it has stalled. I'm not saying that's not a priority. As far as content, yes, by all means, the review board could have some input on that. And I don't necessarily know if I have the answer in front of me on how to obtain that. One is you folks have my email address, but that would be, I know there was some concern about how we receive complaints, or even maybe our complaint process. So I don't know if maybe even the brochure and its content might be relevant or dependent upon a greater conversation to some of your concerns from last week. So it might be premature to come up with this brochure, which is ultimately duplicating information which you were generally not pleased with to begin with. Does that make sense? So maybe we could kind of come up with some new ideas and go forward. How we get that information, I'm not the expert to necessarily do that. I mean, by all means, you can pass that along to me, and we will include that or discuss that. So, but if there wants to be a further discussion on the complaint process at a future meeting, and maybe some expectations on what is and is what's not communicated or how it's communicated, I would then recommend delaying any sort of brochure until after that discussion occurs. And then moving on to the website development. We have a kind of a small victory, and then we're working on a larger victory. So one is, Marie, you had made mention of the complaint form being buried. And so what we did or are working on, so when going to our website, it did say feedback. It actually has been changed, titled complaint. That was a bit of an error. I wanted to say at least, complaints and compliments. And then it will take you to the complaints page, so to speak, and then the goal is to have online generated complaint or compliment forms that would then be directed to the appropriate staff. So that's a work in progress. Then, as mentioned, you had stated there's a broader, redo of the website. Currently, the other two individuals I worked with, they actually met with city staff today. Some just kind of a lay of the land on our website, and admittedly, web design is not my forte at all, but it's currently a WordPress website, and so there's city personnel that has knowledge on how to manipulate most, if not all of it, and then our personnel has keys to part of the kingdom, so to speak. And so, as they met today, and then working on how to revamp the website in totality. So, but my recommendation it'd be maybe kind of a grander discussion on the complaint process, which then would facilitate more clear information on the brochure. And also, I heard you mention, and actually that was a place I thought of, was the city library, but I'm sure there's other places in town that you folks are more aware of than we are. So then direction once that brochure is completed on distribution.
Lieutenant Ernst, this is Board Member Stephanie Littleton. Is it possible that we, I don't know if it's at the point with your rough draft, if we should see that with what and put together our thoughts, or?
Well, admittedly, most of the rough draft contains, and it does need to be worked on, is information that's currently on our website. And so I ask of you folks if we could have your input on this. You've mentioned some ideas or ways you'd like to see the process refined. So instead of trying to keep doing the same thing and expect a different result, maybe we could seek your folks' input. And it would be really a double win. One is we could ideally meet your folks' needs, which ideally would meet the needs of the community, and the brochure would reflect information that you would be pleased with. I could gladly go, and it's basically going to be regurgitating what's on the website in a somewhat fancy form. Fancy might even be an incorrect word, but nice little graphic design. But I think the more important topic is the complaint process and something that would be satisfactory to you folks, and then we regurgitate that information on the brochure.
Thank you, Lieutenant Ernst. I think that's a great idea for a future meeting to put that on, if everybody thinks so.
And I guess, I'll ask Marie only because she's the one that had spoken about the brochure, and then is it okay then to generally put that on pause, so maybe after that conversation takes place, and then we can move from there, or do you have any recommendations?
Board Member Murray Taylor, I think that I think we should. I mean, the content. I think you're committed to this project, which is great.
Yes.
And I don't want it to be that we delay it indefinitely, but I don't think that's how the board is thinking about this issue to begin with. So I don't see that as a huge time delay, and it seems to me most efficient to have it reflect what is the process that will hopefully be made more clear for the public and be reflected in the brochure as well. So I think it's right to I don't like to use the word delay, because I don't see this as a delay necessarily. It's more of just an intentional pause to make sure that it reflects how we want the information to be communicated, and we can continue to work on that too. I had seen through looking at other cities' websites for their boards that examples of brochures too. If that's at all helpful, I can send those to you.
Yes, by all means. Lieutenant David Ernst, I apologize. I'm still getting used to that. By all means, thank you. And so, yeah, I apologize for using delay, but I guess I'm trying to be efficient in the sense of no sense in creating something that ultimately is going to get recreated or amended, or so that was just my intent. By no means am I asking to delay indefinitely, but ultimately, like I said, my recommendation is we have a discussion about the complaint process, get your folks' desires. Ultimately, Captain McKinley and I can't say yes after your recommendations. We'll do that, but we'll take it back to the command staff, develop a process or information, and the brochure would then reflect that new information.
This is Assistant City Manager Brandon McGuire. I might also suggest, just for the board's discussion, since there is a community engagement subcommittee, maybe the staff meets with that subcommittee and works on it in that smaller group, and then we could maybe bring a final draft back to the full board.
Board Member Murray Taylor, I think that sounds like a great idea. Do I see head nods? Okay.
Yeah, this board member Stephanie Littleton, I agree. I think that's a great idea. And Marie, did you have further? I didn't mean to kind of cut in.
No, so Board Member Taylor, and just lastly, which I think kind of dovetails into the other item on the agenda, we did discuss how our plan to engage the public could dovetail into the work that will have to happen as part of the comprehensive review of the police department. So that consultant, once that consultant's on board, there'll be ideally, and I think the expectation that there'll be lots of stakeholder engagement around that process. And so lots of seeking of input from the public related to policing, the police department. And so how to coordinate that so that we don't get ahead of that message and people think that that's all that's going to happen with the comprehensive study, which is not the case. We're just one part of that activity. And so how to coordinate it so that these two efforts are kind of like mutually beneficial. So it may be that the consultant is developing, say, a Lawrence Listen session, and then we perhaps can then tack on 2 or 3 questions that are relevant for our work into that same effort. So they're only having to answer like one survey as opposed to multiple surveys on a related topic. So that was part of our discussion. And if the other subcommittee members want to speak on that, that'd be great. Yeah. Did I capture what we kind of the discussion on that?
This board member is stepping a little too, Marie, it looks like you're getting thumbs up from both of them. So is there anything additional, Marie? Are you good? Yeah.
Actually, one quick interruption, I apologize. Lieutenant David Ernst I forget how we coordinated the last meeting, but I would assume that you would at least want my and/or Captain McKinley's participation in this meeting. And so
I just want to make sure who wants to schedule the meeting is really my question. And I forgot how we went about it the last time, and I did. So that's just why I want to make sure that we don't drop the ball.
Yeah, Assistant City Manager Brandon McGuire. Thanks for asking the question, Lieutenant Ernst. I was going to jump in before we moved on to the next item as well, and just make sure we get clarification on how we'll connect between the staff and the subcommittee members to schedule a meeting.
Marie Taylor, board member. How about Brandon, if you help us set up a meeting and include representatives from the city along with the staff members, and so Captain McKinley as well, and basically the same crew as last time, except not the communication folks. How's that sound?
Brandon McGuire, Assistant City Manager. That will work very, very well. We'll go with that. Thank you.
Okay, this board member, Stephanie Littleton, and we're going to move on to the next agenda then. And I want to thank Marie, all 3 of you very much for all of the notes. Really are very explanatory about, it looks like you covered quite a bit on your first meeting. So, that's really, really, really good. Yes.
This is Assistant City Manager Brandon McGuire. I would advise that the board actually entertain a motion and vote
to receive the minutes.
Appreciate you bringing that up because I was wondering if we should do that. So, okay. Anyone like to motion for these minutes? Sanjay puts the first motion. Is there a second motion? Is that Jenny?
It looks like Jane is raising her hand.
Oh, okay. I didn't see Jane. Okay. Jane, are you making a motion?
Yes. Sanjay Mishra, board member, make a motion to accept the minutes of the Community Engagement Subcommittee.
Okay. And the second motion, Jane?
I'll second the motion. Thank you.
Okay. And we'll accept that. We're going to move on for a vote then. I'm going to start with Jane. For you, yay or nay?
Yay.
Okay. Sanjay?
Yay.
Jenny?
Yay.
Marie?
Yay.
Is that all of us and myself, of course? Yes. So that's unanimous. We have accepted them. Thank you all. Okay, we're going to move on to the next agenda. So we're going to get an update on the policing study consultation selection process.
Thank you. This is Assistant City Manager Brandon McGuire. I just wanted to provide a brief, very brief
verbal update on the status of our consultant selection process for the board. I'm happy to report that we have completed the selection process up to the point of getting a contract finalized, and we are in negotiations with the selected consultant, just putting the final touches on the scope of work that we can use as an exhibit to the professional services agreement. So we plan on taking that agreement to the City Commission on October 20th. I had really hoped to be able to have a final draft agreement to present to the board at this meeting. And I really hope to be able to present that final draft to the board at least before we sent it to the City Commission for their final approval. So I apologize that has not been, we've not been able to move based on the meeting schedule of this board. But I wanted to take the opportunity, and I should say, we don't want to delay taking the agreement to the City Commission because October 20th will be our last meeting of this month, and that means that we won't have an agreement to the Commission until November. And the later we get into the year, the more difficult it becomes to make meaningful progress before the holidays. And so we are very excited to take this agreement and get started with the project. I believe many folks are feeling the same sense of urgency as well. And so I did want to revisit, and we linked the request for proposals, which includes the scope of work that the consultants use to guide their outline of task items. And so we do have obviously a very responsive consultant. In total, we received 10 proposals. We found all of them to be very responsive, and we had many well-qualified consultant teams from across the country that competed. So this was a very competitive procurement process, probably the most competitive I've ever been involved in my career. And so we were very excited about the competitiveness of it. And we had I think a very engaging and very rigorous selection process in terms of the review of the proposals, as well as the interview and applied exercise that we sent the final 3 consultants through. And so we used members of this board, Board Member Taylor and Chair Salvini were involved in that process, and they brought a very helpful perspective, very critical eye to the review. We also had several members from community groups that were representing their stakeholders, and so in addition to that, we also had members of our staff, our labor group represented. We had several of some of our really talented leaders from other departments, including our municipal services operations, city attorney's office, finance, fire, EMS, and other departments, just to get more of a diverse perspective on this consultant agreement and the selection process. And so it was a very rigorous process. The final 3 consultants who were selected based on their written proposals, they were invited to interview with all of the folks who reviewed those written proposals, in addition to some other folks as well. And we conducted an hour interview with each of the 3 consultants. And so they did a presentation and then question and answer with our full group, which was about 24 people between city staff and our community stakeholders. And then the second half of the day, during the interview process, we structured an exercise where each of the 3 consultants led a facilitated engagement session with 3 different groups. And so each consultant had to facilitate 3 public engagement meetings or stakeholder engagement meetings with city staff and our community stakeholders back to back to back. So it was a very rigorous selection process that we put them through, and all 3 of the finalists performed admirably. It was extremely competitive, which is exactly what you want. And so we feel good. We feel very comfortable recommending this consultant. I wanted to provide the board with one last opportunity after doing even more work amongst yourselves and just as a community, hearing more conversations, gaining more information about our policing and really our whole spectrum of care of how we care for people in need. I wanted to just provide one more opportunity for the board members to identify any additional tasks or goals or items that we should try to scope into this project. The last time we asked this question, the board, you provided some very good input in that reflected in our final RFP and the evaluation tools that we use throughout our selection process. One example was Dr. Gibson's prioritization of data competency and how do we evaluate that in our process. And so you've provided very helpful insight and feedback through this process so far. And I just wanted to provide one more opportunity to go back and take a look at this scope of work that we had drafted in the RFP, in which the consultants were responsive to in the tasks and methodology that they outlined, and just give you one more chance to think, is there anything that we're missing? Anything else that we need to address through this study? And I see Dr. Misha raising his hand. I also want to say, if any of you, if you don't have a list of items right now, please feel free to email me directly without copying other board members, but email me directly with that feedback over the next, really the next week, anytime between now and probably next Wednesday would work for us.
Sanjay Mishra, board member. Brandon, so I heard you say that you are in negotiations about scope and absolutely the value of the contract with this person. Are our board members part of that? How much different will the final scope be compared to the RFP?
Assistant City Manager Brandon McGuire. That's a very good question. So when I say negotiation, I use that term because that's more of a commonly known and used term. I actually call this the clarification process, and I think even in the RFP we labeled it the clarification process, where it's not so much of a negotiation. I mean, we have in my view a very comprehensive scope of work in the RFP, and so we want to clarify that what we've received and the conversations we've had through the interview process and what we've read in their lists of tasks and methodologies, that they're saying what we think they're saying, they're meaning what we think they're meaning, and making sure that when each of us signs the contract, there's no ambiguity about what the expectations are, what the deliverables are, and how we're going to go through the process to reach those. And so really it's much more of a clarification. We actually have not changed the scope. It's just making sure when the consultant says we're going to do public engagement, well, how much public engagement? What methods are you going to use? Considering the current circumstances, are you planning on coming here and holding meetings, in person? Because that's not going to work. And so it's things like that. How many hours of public engagement? So that's the nature of the conversations we're having right now.
Thank you, Brandon.
You're welcome. Assistant City Manager Brandon McGuire, I did want to add one more comment, which is I have shared the City Commission's task list. And this was the list that came from Mayor Ananda back in June. And some of those charges have been taken up by this board. And so we have discussed that and made it known that is, our intent is to address those requests from the city commission through this project as well. We did draft the RFP and the scope of work with that in mind, but we wanted to be very explicit about that, you know, if the consultant feels like what they've given us does not contemplate the work of that list, then we need to come to some understanding about how we're going to clarify that and make sure that it's in the contract. Jump right in, Marie.
Marie Taylor, board member. Thank you, Brennan, for letting us have this opportunity to weigh in on a possible scope of work for this consultant. I would love to see some recommendations on the complaint process form and process that we've discussed. We've been discussing for the past month. So, and now that we've heard today, even more really great information in the presentation we had about accountability mechanisms. And I think even our presenter mentioned this LA had a flow chart that explained how they did their process for handling complaints so that it was systematic and consistent. So if the consultant could provide some guidance on best practices along those lines, that would be really a real improvement to our system for our police department. So if that's a way, if we could fit that into the scope, and when I look at the RFP, there was nothing that explicit. But if there's an opportunity to carve out a task related to that, that would be a huge benefit for us.
Assistant City Manager Brandon McGuire, that's an excellent point. Thank you. And so I'll say with a study like this, there's a lot of qualitative information gathering, data gathering. I'm still trying to determine if qualitative is actual data. I'm sure Dr. Gibson has volume of knowledge on that. And so there's a lot of interviewing. The consultant will meet with members of this board, meet with members of our city commission. And by members, I mean all of you. We will arrange meetings with all of you and the consultants as well as city commissioners. And so things like that will come up. Concerns, where are we weak, where are we strong? And that will also help guide their work. And so as you interview with the consultants and as others do, these things will come up. And just because it's not explicitly spelled out as a task in the scope, it doesn't mean, or in the contract, it doesn't mean that we can't still ask them to do that and get that from them. We don't want to be so narrow in trying to identify every step that the consultant will take on. And so that is certainly feedback that I'll share with the consultant. And if they feel like, that's something that naturally they would do, if they heard that in an interview, that there's concerns about the complaint process. We want to know more information about it, want to know best practices. If that's something that would then prompt them to research that and do more digging, and they would do that without needing to write that as an explicit task, then we'll probably proceed that way.
This is board member Stephanie Littleton. I do have a question for Lieutenant Ernst. And I know this question is about CALIA. I know how important, that it is for the department to gain accreditation for that. I guess my question goes back to the comprehensive bias-based policing plan. Is that in CALIA as far as part of their accreditation requirements?
Well, the quick answer is I don't know. I was thinking of what was my pause is we have the Lexipol policy system, and so it will identify certain policies that are accreditation standards. So I was thinking if that one was. So ultimately the answer is I don't know. I don't know.
Apologize. I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
Oh, you're fine. No, and I don't feel on the spot with that. I just Captain Adam Heffley is currently the one spearheading or working on the accreditation process. I don't know how far along he is in the sense of if he would even be able to answer that question if he were sitting here. But yeah, my honest answer is I don't know if that's part of it.
Yeah, I tried to look that up as we were going through this evening on my iPad, and I couldn't find, it has listed out, Clea's got so much for accreditation, but I couldn't find that. But if we maybe find that information, I'm curious, where the police department might want to go with that. I know I've asked on that a couple of times, just to what extent we want to go with the comprehensive plan.
Your audio, at least on my end, might be kind of muting out a little bit distant. So if you don't mind repeating what you just said about the police department.
Sure. I would like to see if we could get some kind of understanding from the police department if that's something that you're looking to do, whether it's for CLE or not. I guess I'm just interested as far as the board on finding that information out.
So if I understand you correctly, is wanting to do the comprehensive plan. And so I believe, to my limited understanding, because admittedly I'm learning like you folks what the comprehensive plan consists of. I had minimal understanding of it. And I believe that is something that is adopted by the governing body. And so I don't know. Obviously, there's going to be things that the tasks or requirements of the police department, which I would generally assume that, yes, we'd be willing to improve and do those things. But how to say, yes, we have the comprehensive plan. If you remember, I'm going to backtrack a little bit, but this came about when doing the annual bias-based policing report to the AG's office, and we currently checked, no, we don't have this plan. And so we reached out to the AG's office, and my limited understanding is this is something that's adopted by the governing body. Under what way, shape, or form, or how that's adopted, I don't know. Some of the things that were mentioned, we currently have, and so the answer is yes. I mean, there would be a desire for this comprehensive plan. How we get there, I don't immediately know. And so we probably just need more, at least I personally would need more information.
Sure, no, fair enough. Brandon, is that something, possibility in the scope that we would, I'm not sure if we'd want to consider for the scope of the RFP?
This is, yeah, City Manager Brandon, or Assistant City Manager Brandon McGuire. I apologize. So something like that, and maybe I should start with the end in mind. So the results of this study, the final deliverable that we'll get from the consultant, is a master plan it's going to be the department's master plan. And so things like, things like through this study process, we identified that a bias-based policing comprehensive plan was something that the Community Police Review Board was interested in pursuing, or interested in advising the city to pursue. Here's information about those bias-based policing master plans. Here's some examples of what other communities do. In the consultant's opinion, we believe that this would be a value-added sort of exercise, and we would recommend doing this, developing a bias-based policing master plan, adopting it by the governing body, and we believe that it would take 6 to 12 months to complete that. And so that would be sort of something that they would identify in the master plan that they create for the department. Sort of the same thing with the complaint process. Here are issues that we heard about the complaint process. Here's what the literature says. Here's what the data says in our analysis, the consultant's analysis. Here's the consultant's opinion, and how we would advise you to prioritize that effort and what resources it may take to accomplish that. Does that help you visualize kind of that sort of iterative process where they do their own information and data gathering through interviews, through actual data analysis, and then they identify where those opportunities are, what the expectation of the community, of the stakeholders of the department are. They marry all those together, and they develop a master plan for the department.
Yes, I appreciate the clarity. Thank you. I think Marie has a question.
Maureen Taylor, board member. Just to weigh in on what this discussion, I asked similar questions as the representative from this board on the review committee for with these consultants, and so I also through those questions learned that it's really more of a roadmap that they're providing, and we still have to do all the heavy lifting to make the plans happen and actualize this roadmap that the city would have. So yeah, we don't get off easy. They give us some resources, but we have to do all the hard work, which is, appropriate.
Assistant City Manager Brandon McGuire, I couldn't have stated it better.
This board member, Stephanie Littleton, well, I think we're probably all up for that, so that will be fine. We'll be ready for their interviews and their questions. Did anybody have anything further for Brandon? Appreciate the update, Brandon, very much.
Stephanie?
Yes, go ahead.
Sanjay Mishra, board member. Can I piggyback on Marie's question about the complaint process? Because remember last time we discussed what's a complaint. And I have tried to look hard around, and I don't find a definition of when a conversation becomes a complaint. Can somebody help us with that? Can the consultant be asked to provide, because they have knowledge about other things other than me. So hopefully because they are the experts. So maybe they can help provide some guidance to that effect. And I have some ideas, but I want to look for the consultant.
Yes, Assistant City Manager Brandon McGuire. Yes, that is exactly something that the consultant would, it would become clear in interviewing you, the 5 of you, or 7 board members, and then others, that this is something that's important. This complaint process, learning more about it, better defining it, flow charting it. That's something, in fact, in a different discussion, a discussion of a different item in one of our meetings, actually, just this afternoon. And that's something that we talked about, was their willingness, their capability of process mapping and flow charting these sorts of things. And so I think that's that's something that they'll help bring to the study process. And in other studies I've seen, sort of comprehensive development studies or master plan or strategic plan studies. Those are things that do come out in the final report of, here's documentation of your process, and then here are areas where your process could be altered, could be improved, could be better refined or defined. And so I do think that that's a natural outcome or a natural part of the final work product that they come up with. And I will say I have documented those comments in the minutes, so that will be part of the record, and we'll be able to point back to those, and that'll help keep us, the project management team, accountable as well, to make sure that we get those deliverables from the consultants.
Very well. This is board member Stephanie Littleton. Good extra discussion, so thank you all. If we are ready, we'll move on to the last agenda item, which is this is going to be just an informal discussion for all of us to discuss the upcoming election of chair and vice chair positions. Excuse me, scheduled for October 21st. So just kind of open that up for discussion to see who may be interested. And not everybody step up at once. How about, why don't we start with talking about the chair position? You see, unless somebody has some other ideas, just who's interested in maybe serving. Sanjay?
My mic was unmuted because I was going to suggest some names, but at this point, I'm not interested. I have a full plate because I have the university thing that I'm handling. So this is a crazy year for me. Otherwise, I would, yes, I would do it. This is a very critical year for the board, because what we do will make life, get things on track later on. So it's a critical year. And having said that, I want to pull my name out, so which doesn't, it's not fair, but I hope you understand.
Vice Chair.
This board member, Stephanie Littleton, I agree. This is
Really going to be a critical year. We've got great new additions to our board, Jenny and Marie, and we're starting to make some steps forward. So it's exciting, but also there's some real critical things to be done. So, I mean, I appreciate, your thoughts and what you share with us, Sanjay.
Stephanie? This is Assistant City Manager Brandon McGuire. I don't want to interject into the board's discussion, but if you don't mind, I might provide a little bit more context.
Sure, go ahead.
So for our two new board members, or you're not so new anymore, but relatively new, who have not gone through an election, the bylaws state that, and I'm paraphrasing, but the bylaws state that the board will elect on an annual basis the chair and the vice chair. And so it is a annually rotating position, or at least it's up for election every year. And so that's really the context for this, is that the last election occurred last October. And so we've come up on that 1 year timeline. And so to be consistent with the bylaws, it's time to think about the next election. And as Stephanie said, the purpose of this discussion is not to make nominations at this point. I think the nominations will happen at the next meeting as part of a scheduled agenda item. But I just wanted to make sure that you were aware of what prompts this discussion in the requirement in the bylaws.
Jane?
Jane Gibson, board member. So rotation is not mandated in the bylaws, just that we have an election every year?
Assistant City Manager Brandon McGuire. Yes, it's very limited in discussion. It simply says that every year the board will elect a chair and vice chair, and that election, and they will serve a 1 year position essentially from the date of that election, or as close to as possible.
Thank you.
This is board member Stephanie Littleton. Brandon, thank you for the context. I appreciate it. You should have provided some of that background for some that have not been through this. So really, yeah, this is just, like I said, very informal, just to get some thought and discussion going in that direction for our next meeting. And not that somebody has to step up and say, yes, I want to, but certainly we're open for any kind of discussion in that manner.
So board member Marie Taylor, Stephanie, how do you feel about continuing in your role or becoming chair? I would like to know your thoughts on that.
This board member, Stephanie Littleton, I've thought about it quite a bit in the last couple of weeks, knowing that this was forthcoming. I like the vice chair to be able to help kind of put the the thought as far as what's important on the agenda and where we're driving things. I'm really not really ready to take on the chair, since I do have quite a bit on my plate with a pretty involved job, but I think most people probably have that as well. So I may defer to somebody else for the chair, but I'm here for the board, so whatever that needs to be, I will. But I feel strongly more on the vice chair than on the chair. But thank you for the question.
this board member, Stephanie Littleton, any other thoughts on this matter?
Marie Taylor, board member. I'm curious what Tonya thinks. If she was here, I would love to have her. I'll have to wait for her thoughts till next board meeting, but to see how she feels about continuing in the role too.
This board member, Stephanie Littleton, sure, yeah. And we'll have obviously some more time to discuss on the next one before we make that vote, but just get some thoughts going on it, everyone. And I think we'll just go on and move to the calendar. It looks like, so our next meeting is set, I believe, Brandon, for October 21st. It looks like it's 6 p.m. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's accurate.
Okay. Will we have the other half of the training with Kate?
Assistant City Manager Brandon McGuire. It is scheduled for that meeting, yes.
Okay, all right. So, okay, so we'll have that, and then we can add some additional, looks like, for the vote and what have you. And then the meeting on Thursday, November 12th, is that set as well?
Yes, it is.
Okay, all right. Any other thoughts from the board? Sanjay?
Yes, Sanjay Mishra, board member. Stephanie, between you and Tanya, you need to do a chair report or something, right? Or do you think you have to do a chair's report?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand.
Do you think you have to do a report from the chair, which you submit to the board? Remember, we started that practice end of the year. You wound up saying this is important, this is not important, or something, whatever. Means that's your report. And then we can talk about it. So maybe Tanya should be looked into that.
Yeah, this board member, Stephanie Littleton, very good point. That's correct. The previous chair had written some really good points for us. So, yeah, I can communicate that with Tanya for the next meeting.
Anybody else have anything else before we close for the evening? Is everybody ready to end? Yeah, look like thumbs up, yeses. Okay, all right. Well, thanks everyone, Brandon, Lieutenant Ernst, Trent McKinley, all of you for your assistance tonight and everybody's input. All right.
Yes, thank you very much.
All right. Hope everyone has a good rest.
We do need a motion.
Oh, okay.
Oh, motion. I move a motion to adjourn.
Okay.
Sanjay Mishra, board member, move a motion to adjourn.
And Jane?
Jane Gibson, board member, I second.
Okay. Second motion. Do I have to have a vote on that, Brandon?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So, okay, we'll go around. Sanjay?
Yes.
Yes. Jane?
Yes.
Jenny?
Yes.
Marie?
Yes.
Stephanie? Yes. All right. Thank you all very much. Hope you have a good rest of the night.
Thank
you.
you.
You too. Thank you.
Night.